January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 2:47 a.m. The snow fell in silence, thick and relentless, blanketing the frozen earth where men had died only hours before. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees below zero. In the darkness, a German tank commander named Hauptmann Friedrich Wolf stood in the turret of his Panther, breath crystallizing in the air, watching the tree line to the west. He had been ordered to hold this position at all costs. The Führer himself had declared that the Ardennes offensive would split the Allied armies in two, drive them back to the sea, and win Germany time to develop wonder weapons that would turn the tide of war. Wolf believed this. He had to believe this. Behind him, the Reich was crumbling. Before him, in the American lines, he imagined chaos, disorder, a citizen army of shopkeepers and farm boys who had never known true hardship, who would break and scatter when faced with German steel and will. He was wrong. What Hauptmann Wolf could not see, could not comprehend in that frozen moment before dawn, was that 40 miles to his south, an entire American army was moving, not retreating, not repositioning cautiously over days and weeks as military doctrine dictated, moving as one living organism, a force of over 250,000 men, with their tanks, their guns, their trucks, their fuel, their ammunition, pivoting 90 degrees in the middle of winter, in the middle of battle, and racing north through ice and snow to strike at the exposed flank of the German offensive. It was an operation that violated every principle of military logic, that defied the limitations of weather, terrain, and human endurance. And it was happening in a single night. This is the story of how America moved an army while Germany watched in disbelief. It is the story of logistics transformed into weapon, of abundance weaponized, of a nation's industrial soul made manifest on frozen roads in the heart of Europe. It is the story of the moment when German commanders, trained in the finest military academies, veterans of campaigns from Poland to the gates of Moscow, realized they were not fighting an army, they were fighting a civilization. The German offensive that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, with the roar of artillery fire that shattered the winter quiet of the Ardennes. For Germany, it was a desperate gamble, a final throw of the dice by a regime that could read its own obituary in the advance of Allied armies from the west and Soviet forces from the east. Adolf Hitler had conceived the operation himself, overruling the objections of his generals, demanding that 3 armies over 400,000 men and more than 1,200 tanks drive through the lightly defended Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, the attack would encircle and destroy for Allied armies, force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, and allow Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviets. The plan was codenamed Whacked M. Rheinwatch on the Rhine, deliberate deception to suggest a defensive operation. In the weeks before the attack, German commanders moved their forces under cover of darkness and radio silence. They positioned their tanks in the forests, their artillery in camouflaged positions, their infantry in jumping-off points along an 85-mile front. They chose the Ardennes specifically because Allied intelligence considered it unsuitable for armored operations. The terrain was rough, the roads narrow, the forests dense. The American units holding this sector were either inexperienced divisions brought here to learn the ropes in a quiet zone, or exhausted divisions sent here to rest and refit after months of brutal combat. Hitler counted on surprise, on whether that would ground Allied air power, and on the speed of his armored spearheads to reach the Meuse before the Americans could react. For the first 48 hours, the plan worked. The German assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American positions were overrun. Entire units were surrounded. Communications broke down. The weather was indeed terrible: snow, fog, freezing rain grounding the Allied air forces that had dominated the skies since Normandy. German tank columns punched deep into American lines, creating a bulge in the front that would give the battle its name. In the chaos of those first days, it seemed possible that Hitler's mad gamble might succeed. But Hitler and his generals had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had planned this operation as if they were still fighting the War of 1940, when German tanks had raced through France, when speed and aggression and tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantage. They had not grasped that the nature of warfare itself had changed. They were still thinking in terms of armies. America was fighting with an economy. Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. received the call on the afternoon of December 19, 1944. He was at his headquarters in Nancy, France, over 100 miles south of the German breakthrough. His Third Army was in the middle of its own offensive, pushing east toward the Saar River, grinding through German defenses with a methodical brutality that characterized Patton's approach to war. The call came from Supreme Headquarters, from General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. The situation in the Ardennes was critical. The Germans had broken through. American forces were falling back. The vital crossroads town of Bastogne was surrounded. Eisenhower was convening an emergency conference of all senior commanders at Verdun the next morning. Patton was to attend. Patton hung up the phone and turned to his staff. "We're going to have to change direction," he said. The words were simple, but their implication was staggering. Patton's Third Army consisted of 6 divisions in contact with the enemy along a 100-mile front, with another 4 divisions in reserve or moving up to disengage these forces, turn them 90 degrees to the north, and march them over 100 miles through winter weather to attack into the southern flank of the German offensive would require. Logistical coordination of breathtaking complexity. Every vehicle would need fuel. Every unit would need ammunition. Every man would need food. Supply dumps would need to be relocated. Lines of communication would need to be re-established. Routes would need to be cleared of snow and ice. And all of this would need to happen while maintaining combat readiness, while keeping the Germans to the east from realizing what was happening and attacking into the exposed American flank. Before leaving for Verdun, Patton called in his operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, and his logistics officer, Colonel Walter Muller. "Gentlemen," he said, "I want you to prepare 3 plans for moving Third Army north. The first plan assumes we move 1 division. The second assumes 3 divisions. The third assumes 6 divisions. I want routes, timetables, fuel requirements, ammunition loads, everything, and I want it ready by the time I get back from Verdun tomorrow." His staff stared at him. Moving 6 divisions over 100,000 men would take weeks of preparation under normal circumstances. Patton was asking for a plan in less than 24 hours, for a movement that would begin in less than 48 hours. "Sir," Muller began, "to move 6 divisions. I know what I'm asking." Patton interrupted. "The Krauts think they've broken through. They think we're going to pull back, regroup, take our time responding. They think we fight the way they fight. They don't understand what we can do. They're about to learn." The conference at Verdun took place on December 19th in a cold, bare room in a French army barracks. Eisenhower gathered his commanders around a table: British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, American Generals Omar Bradley, Jacob Devers, and Patton. The mood was grim. The German offensive had torn a 50-mile wide gap in the American lines. 2 entire regiments had been forced to surrender. The Germans were advancing on multiple axes. Bastogne was surrounded but still holding. The weather showed no signs of clearing. Eisenhower, normally calm and diplomatic, was visibly tense. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster," Eisenhower began, trying to inject confidence into a room filled with anxiety. "There will be only cheerful faces at this table." Patton, who had a gift for reading the theatrical possibilities of any moment, grinned. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut him off and chew him up." No one laughed. Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George, I want you to go to Luxembourg and take charge of the battle. I want you to move Third Army north and hit the Germans in the flank. How soon can you attack?" Patton did not hesitate. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. There was silence in the room. Bradley shook his head. "Don't be fatuous, George. You're 100 miles away. You're engaged with the enemy on your front. To disengage, move north, and attack in 2 days is impossible." Patton pulled a map from his coat pocket and spread it on the table. "I've already worked out the details. 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry will disengage tonight, move north on 3 parallel routes, and be in position to attack the morning of December 22nd. If you want more than 3 divisions, I can have 6 divisions on the move within 72 hours. Eisenhower studied the map. He knew Patton's reputation for aggressive action, but he also knew Patton's tendency toward grandiose promises. "George, if you do this, it will be the most brilliant operation of the war." "I'll do it," Patton said. What no one in that room fully understood, what even Patton himself did not yet fully comprehend, was that this operation would not succeed or fail based on the courage of American soldiers or the tactical acumen of American commanders. It would succeed or fail based on trucks, on fuel, on radios, on maps, on spare parts, on the 10,000 invisible details that separate an army from a mob. It would succeed or fail based on whether America's industrial civilization could be projected across an ocean and made to function in the frozen forests of Belgium with the precision of a machine. The movement began that night. On the evening of December 19th, as Patton was driving back from Verdun to his headquarters, orders were already going out to Third Army's divisions. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, was in the middle of an attack towards its tank crews were exhausted, its vehicles low on fuel, its supply lines stretched. The division received orders to break off the attack, reassemble, and prepare to move north. Within 6 hours, the division had disengaged from contact with the enemy, consolidated its units, refueled its vehicles, and begun moving toward assembly areas. By midnight, the first tanks were rolling north. The 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee Division, composed largely of National Guard troops from New England, was holding defensive positions along the Saar River. Its regiments were scattered across 30 miles of front. The division's commander, Major General Willard Paul, received his orders at 9 p.m. by dawn. The division had pulled out of its positions, handed them over to units moving up from reserve, and was on the road north. The 80th Infantry Division, the Blue Ridge Division, followed the same pattern. Orders at night, movement by dawn. What made this possible was not courage or discipline, though American soldiers demonstrated both in abundance. What made this possible was logistics on a scale the world had never seen. The United States Army in Europe in December 1944 was supplied by a system so vast, so complex, so staggeringly efficient that it rendered obsolete every previous conception of military operations. Consider the numbers. By December 1944, the United States had shipped to Europe over 3 million soldiers, 5 million tons of supplies, and over 500,000 vehicles. Every day, American ports in England and France unloaded an average of 50,000 tons of cargo. This cargo moved from ports to frontline units through a transportation network that included over 20,000 trucks, organized into transport companies that ran in continuous loops, day and night, from supply depots to forward units. The U.S. Army called this the Red Ball Express, and at its peak it moved 12,000 tons of supplies per day over hundreds of miles of French roads. Each American division required between 600 and 700 tons of supplies per day when engaged in active combat. For Third Army to move 6 divisions over 100 miles and launch them into attack required not just moving the divisions themselves, but moving the entire supply infrastructure that kept them functioning: fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, food trucks, medical trucks, maintenance trucks, signal trucks. Each division's movement had to be coordinated not just with the other divisions, but with the supply convoys that would keep them fed, fueled, and armed once they reached their destination. Colonel Walter Muller, Patton's logistics officer, worked through the night of December 19th to 20th with his staff, calculating tonnages, allocating vehicles, designating routes, establishing supply points. The challenge was not just moving 250,000 men, the challenge was moving them without creating traffic jams that would paralyze the entire operation, without running out of fuel halfway through, without losing units in the darkness and snow, without breaking down the fragile infrastructure of Belgian and Luxembourg roads that had already been damaged by months of military traffic. Muller's solution was to designate 3 primary routes north, codenamed routes A, B, and C. Each division would have its own route. Military police would be stationed at every intersection to direct traffic and prevent congestion. Fuel dumps would be established at 50-mile intervals. Maintenance units would be positioned along the routes to repair broken down vehicles and tow them off the road to keep traffic moving. Radio nets would be established to allow real-time communication between moving units and headquarters. Every regiment, every battalion, every company had a timetable that specified exactly when they would reach each control point along the route. It was the industrialization of warfare, the application of American mass production principles to the movement of human beings and machines. Henry Ford's assembly line translated into military operations. The German commanders, watching from the other side of the battlefield, did not understand what they were seeing. On the morning of December 20th, German reconnaissance units reported increased American vehicle traffic on roads south of the Odd. German intelligence officers interpreted this as panic, as American units fleeing the battlefield. Throughout December 20th and 21st, as Third Army's columns rolled north, German commanders remained focused on driving west toward the Meuse. They believed they had achieved strategic surprise, that the Allies would need weeks to organize a coherent response, that by the time any American counterattack materialized, German forces would already be across the Meuse and driving toward Antwerp. Hauptmann Friedrich Wolf, the Panther tank commander in the Ardennes forest, received updates from his regimental headquarters throughout those days. The news was encouraging. German spearheads had advanced over 50 miles. The Americans were in disarray. Bastogne was surrounded and would surely fall within days. The weather remained terrible, grounding Allied aircraft. Everything was proceeding according to plan. On the night of December 21st, Wolf's battalion was ordered to move south to reinforce units facing unexpected American resistance near the town of Bingen. Wolf's Company 5 Panther tanks moved out at midnight, navigating by moonlight through snow-covered roads. They reached their assigned positions by dawn on December 22nd and took up defensive positions on a low ridge overlooking a valley. Wolf positioned his tank behind a stone wall, with clear fields of fire to the south. He ordered his crew to dig the tank in, to camouflage it with branches and snow. Standard defensive procedure. At 6:30 a.m., as the winter sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, Wolf heard the sound. At first he thought it was artillery fire, a distant rumble from the west where German forces were still pushing forward, but the sound didn't fade. It grew louder. It was continuous, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. Wolf raised his binoculars and looked south, down the valley. What he saw made no sense. The valley was filling with vehicles, American vehicles. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks and tanks, hundreds of them, thousands of them, moving north in columns that stretched to the horizon. They moved with headlights on, in perfect order, spaced exactly, maintaining speed. They looked like a parade, not an army in combat. Wolf grabbed his radio handset. All units, this is Wolf. I have American armor moving north in battalion strength. Request fire mission. His radio operator interrupted. "Sir, I'm receiving similar reports from all units on the net. American columns are reported on all approach routes." Wolf stared through his binoculars. Not battalion strength. This was division strength. Multiple divisions, an entire army, moving north as one coordinated mass. How was this possible? His unit had been fighting Americans for months, ever since Normandy. He knew how they fought. They were cautious, methodical. They never moved without establishing overwhelming firepower first. They never took risks. And yet here they were, moving through territory that German forces still partially controlled, moving at night, moving with a speed and confidence that seemed to violate everything Wolf had been taught about how Americans waged war. He lowered his binoculars and realized, with a cold certainty that cut through the morning air like the wind across the snow, that Germany was going to lose this battle. Not because German soldiers lacked courage, not because German tanks were inferior, though by this stage of the war, American Shermans outnumbered German Panthers by ratios that made tactical skill irrelevant. Germany was going to lose because the Americans had turned logistics into a weapon, had transformed their industrial capacity into a form of violence that could not be stopped by tactical brilliance or individual valor. They had brought their factories to the battlefield. They had brought their highways, their assembly lines, their entire civilian economy, and they had weaponized abundance itself. At 9 a.m. on December 22, 1944, the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A attacked north toward Bastion. The attack went in with over 100 tanks, supported by armored infantry, artillery, and, for the first time in a week, fighter bombers that had finally been able to take off as the weather began to clear. The German forces in the path of this attack had been expecting to continue their own advance west. Instead, they found themselves fighting for survival against an enemy who appeared out of nowhere with overwhelming force. The 26th Infantry Division attacked simultaneously to the east of the 4th Armored. The 80th Infantry Division attacked to the west. Third Army's assault was not a desperate counterattack thrown together in the heat of battle. It was a coordinated offensive involving 3 divisions attacking on parallel axes, supported by over 400 artillery pieces, supplied by thousands of trucks, guided by radio communications that allowed Patton's headquarters to monitor and adjust the attack in real time within 24 hours. Third Army had driven a wedge into the southern flank of the German offensive. Within 48 hours, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division had broken through to Bastogne, ending the siege. Within a week, Third Army had committed 6 divisions to the battle, exactly as Patton had promised. By January, the German offensive was not just stopped but reversed. By the end of January, American and British forces had driven the Germans back to their starting positions and were preparing to cross into Germany itself. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered as Germany's last major offensive in the West, as the battle where American soldiers held against overwhelming odds, as the siege of Bastogne and the heroic defense by the 101st Airborne Division. All of this was true, but the battle was decided not in Bastogne but on the roads south of the Odd. In the 72 hours when an entire American army pivoted on its axis and moved across 100 miles of winter terrain to strike with perfect coordination, it was decided by truck drivers who drove through the night without sleep, by logistics officers who calculated fuel consumption down to the gallon, by mechanics who kept vehicles running in temperatures that froze engine oil, by military police who stood at intersections directing traffic while German shells fell around them. It was decided by American abundance, by the cornucopia of industrial production that allowed the United States to field an army of millions supplied by thousands of ships and tens of thousands of aircraft and hundreds of thousands of trucks. It was decided by a nation that could build a Liberty ship in 4 days, that could produce a bomber every 63 minutes, that could manufacture enough trucks to give every American division more vehicles than the entire German army possessed. The German soldiers who witnessed this movement, who saw the scale and speed of American logistics made manifest, experienced a kind of psychological shock that no amount of training or indoctrination could prepare them for. They had been told that Americans were soft, that they lacked the martial spirit of true warriors, that they were individualistic and undisciplined. What they saw instead was coordination on an inhuman scale, a mechanized precision that suggested not individual soldiers, but a single vast organism operating with perfect unity. Oberleutnant Hans Schmid, a company commander in the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, wrote in his diary on December 23rd, "We have been fighting for 3 days now against fresh American units who seem to appear from nowhere. Yesterday we fought the 4th Armored Division. Today it is the 26th Infantry. How do they move so many troops so quickly? Our own reinforcements take days to arrive, and when they come they are short of fuel, short of ammunition, exhausted from the march. The Americans arrive fresh, with full magazines, with hot food. It is as if they are not fighting a war but conducting a business operation. There is something inhuman about it. This sense of fighting not an army but a machine, not soldiers but a system, recurs throughout German accounts of the battle. They describe being overwhelmed not by superior tactics but by superior quantity, by an enemy who could afford to lose tanks, to lose men, to lose battles, and still come back stronger than before, because behind the front lines was an industrial base that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Consider the contrast in supply systems. A German panzer division required approximately 300 tons of supplies per day when engaged in combat. The German army supplied its divisions through a combination of rail transport, horse-drawn wagons, and a relatively small number of trucks. When German units advanced beyond their rail lines, their supply situation became precarious. During the Ardennes offensive, many German tank units ran out of fuel within the first week of the attack, not because American forces destroyed their supply convoys, but because the German logistics system simply could not keep pace with the speed of advance. German commanders had actually planned to capture American fuel dumps to keep their tanks running, a strategy that revealed both audacity and desperation than American armored division. By contrast, required between 600 and 700 tons of supplies per day and was supported by an organic logistics system that included hundreds of trucks assigned directly to the division, plus access to the vast transportation network of the Red Ball Express and other supply routes. When Third Army moved north, it brought its entire logistics infrastructure with it. Fuel dumps were established before the divisions arrived. Ammunition stocks were pre-positioned. Supply convoys were already rolling toward the new assembly areas before the first combat units reached them. This was not simply a matter of American wealth, though wealth was certainly a factor. It was a matter of systematic planning, of an organizational culture that valued logistics as highly as tactics, that understood warfare in the 20th century was fundamentally an industrial activity. The United States had spent the years before entering World War II studying the logistics of modern war, when America's industrial mobilization began after Pearl Harbor. It was guided by careful analysis of what a modern army required. The result was an unitary logistics system that was perhaps the most sophisticated organizational achievement in human history up to that point. At the heart of this system was the truck. The United States produced over 3 million military trucks during World War II. The standard model was the General Motors CCKW, known universally as the Deuce and a Half because of its 2.5-ton cargo capacity. It was a simple vehicle, designed for mass production, powered by a 6-cylinder engine that was robust and easy to maintain. It could operate on rough roads, in extreme weather, with minimal maintenance. It was not glamorous, not impressive to look at, not the kind of weapon that inspired propaganda, posters or newsreels, but the Deuce and a Half won the war. German soldiers who encountered American logistics operations invariably commented on the trucks. They described highways packed with American vehicles moving in continuous streams, supply convoys so long that you could stand and watch them pass for hours. They described vehicle parks where thousands of trucks sat in neat rows, ready to be dispatched. They described the casual abundance of American motor transport, the way American units would use trucks for tasks that German units would accomplish with horses or human labor, simply because trucks were available. Lieutenant Karl Weber, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, was held in a temporary prisoner of war enclosure near Liege, Belgium. The enclosure was simply a field surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by a handful of American military police. Weber and several hundred other German prisoners were held there for 3 days, before being transferred to a permanent POW camp. During those 3 days, Weber later wrote, he spent most of his time watching the road that ran past the enclosure. I stood at the wire and counted vehicles. Weber wrote, I counted for 3 hours and gave up when I reached 2,000. The vehicles never stopped. Trucks carrying fuel, trucks carrying ammunition, trucks carrying food, trucks carrying soldiers, trucks carrying equipment I could not identify. Most were moving east, toward the front. Some were returning empty to be loaded again. I realized that what I was watching was not unusual, not a special operation, but simply the normal functioning of the American supply system. I tried to imagine the factories that built all these vehicles, the oil wells and refineries that produced the fuel, the training camps that produced the drivers, the vast organizational effort required to coordinate all of this movement, and I understood, watching those trucks roll past in endless procession, that Germany had lost the war not when our armies were defeated in battle, but years before, when we chose to fight an enemy with 10 times our industrial capacity. This was the psychological effect of American logistics, not terror, not the fear of death that comes from facing superior firepower, but a kind of despair born from the realization that the material disparity was so vast that individual courage, tactical skill, even operational brilliance could not overcome it. German soldiers in the Ardennes fought with determination, with skill, with the experience of 5 years of war. They were led by competent officers, veterans of campaigns across Europe and Russia. They fought according to doctrine that had proven successful in previous campaigns, and they were crushed not by superior tactics but by superior tonnage, by an enemy that could bring to bear such overwhelming material force that the outcome was never in doubt. The clearing weather on December 23rd brought with it another dimension of American material superiority, air power. With the skies finally clear, the Allied air forces launched their full might against the German offensive. Thousands of sorties were flown, Fighter bombers attacked German tank columns, German supply convoys, German troop concentrations. Medium and heavy bombers struck German rail yards, German fuel depots, German assembly areas. The Luftwaffe attempted to challenge this aerial armada and was swept from the skies. American pilots described seeing so many targets that they could not attack them all. Of German vehicles packed so densely on roads that a single strafing run could destroy dozens. Obergefreiter Ernst Bauer, a machine gunner in an infantry regiment fighting near Patton, later described what it was like to be on the receiving end of American air power. The sound came first, a roar that drowned out even the artillery. Then the aircraft appeared. Flights of 4 or 6, flying low over the treetops. They came in waves, all morning and into the afternoon. We tried to dig deeper into the frozen ground, but the ground was like stone. The bombs fell in sticks that marched across the earth. The machine gun fire sounded like cloth tearing, but each bullet was as thick as your thumb. I saw an American fighter attack a half-track, and the vehicle simply exploded, came apart as if it had been made of paper. When the aircraft finally departed, our company had lost half its vehicles and a quarter of its men, and we knew they would return the next day and the day after, as long as the weather held. The combination of ground assault by Third Army and aerial bombardment created a killing zone from which German forces could not escape. Units that had advanced 50 miles into American territory in the first days of the offensive now found themselves fighting for survival, running low on ammunition, out of fuel, with their supply lines cut and under constant air attack. The offensive ground to a halt, not because of German command decisions but because German units physically could not continue. Tanks stopped when they ran out of fuel and were abandoned. Artillery pieces fell silent when they ran out of shells. Infantry units withdrew on foot because their vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned. By the beginning of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. The German army in the West had lost over 100,000 men killed, wounded or captured, along with hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles. These losses could not be replaced. Germany's reserves were exhausted. Its industrial base was crippled by Allied bombing. Its fuel supplies were nearly depleted. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace had instead consumed Germany's last mobile reserves and left the Western Front defenseless against the Allied offensives that would follow in the spring. Hauptmann Friedrich Wolff survived the battle. His Panther tank was disabled by American tank destroyers on January 8, 1945. During the German withdrawal from the Ardennes, Wolff and his crew abandoned the vehicle and made their way on foot back to German lines. In February, Wolff was reassigned to a training unit in Germany, tasked with preparing new tank crews to replace the catastrophic losses of the winter. He would later write in his memoirs that the assignment felt like a cruel joke. "What was the point of training new crews," he wrote, "when we had no tanks for them to drive? No fuel for those tanks, and no hope of victory. But orders were orders, and so we trained them, these boys of 16 and 17, and sent them west to die in battles that had already been lost before they began." In April 1945, Wolff's training unit was overrun by American forces advancing into central Germany. Wolff surrendered and was sent to a prisoner of war camp in France. There, he joined thousands of other German soldiers, officers and enlisted men, prisoners in the custody of an enemy whose industrial might had crushed them. The camps were not comfortable, but they were adequate. Food was regular, if not abundant. Medical care was available. The guards were neither cruel nor kind, simply professional, treating the prisoners as a logistical problem to be managed efficiently. What struck Wolff most forcefully during his months as a prisoner was the casual abundance of American military operations. The guards wore uniforms that were new, well-fitted, of good quality cloth. They carried weapons that were clean and well-maintained. Their boots were sturdy. When supply trucks arrived at the camp, they arrived on schedule, loaded with everything needed. There was never a shortage. Never a moment when supplies failed to arrive because of bombed rail lines or lack of fuel or administrative breakdown. The American military, even in the management of prisoner of war camps far behind the front lines, functioned with mechanical precision. Wolff was released from captivity in late 1946 and returned to Germany, to a country in ruins, 2 cities reduced to rubble, to an economy that had collapsed, to a people traumatized by total defeat. He never spoke about his wartime experiences except to say that Germany had been defeated by American factories, not American soldiers. He lived until 1982, long enough to see Germany rebuilt with American aid, long enough to see his country become prosperous again as part of the Western Alliance, long enough to understand that the abundance he had witnessed in American military operations was not an aberration but an expression of an entire civilization's approach to organizing human activity. The movement of Third Army during the Battle of the Bulge became a case study in military staff colleges around the world. It was analyzed, dissected, held up as an example of what was possible when logistics, planning, and execution aligned perfectly. But the true significance of the operation went beyond military tactics or operational art. What Patton's army demonstrated was that industrial capitalism, when fully mobilized and directed toward a clear objective, could project power on a scale that previous generations could not have imagined. Consider what the United States accomplished between December 19th and December 22nd, 1944, in 72 hours, while simultaneously fighting a desperate defensive battle in the Ardennes and continuing offensive operations in other sectors of the front. The United States disengaged 10 divisions from combat, moved them an average of 100 miles over winter roads, and launched them in a coordinated offensive against a new enemy. This required the movement of over 250,000 men, over 40,000 vehicles, and over 100,000 tons of supplies. It required real-time coordination between dozens of headquarters, hundreds of units, thousands of individual vehicles. It required weather forecasting to predict when air support could resume. It required fuel calculations to ensure that every vehicle could reach its destination. It required route planning to prevent traffic jams. It required communications networks to allow commanders to adjust plans as circumstances changed, and it worked. It worked because every element of the system had been designed, tested, and refined. It worked because American industry had produced not just weapons but the entire infrastructure of modern warfare: trucks, the radios, the spare parts, the fuel cans, the maps, the field telephones, the 10,000 mundane items that allowed an army to function. It worked because American training had produced not just soldiers but mechanics, drivers, radio operators, supply clerks, traffic directors, all the specialists required to keep a modern army moving. It worked because American organizational culture valued planning, logistics, and staff work as much as tactical brilliance and individual heroism. The German army that opposed Third Army in the Ardennes was not inferior in courage or fighting skill. German soldiers were experienced, well-trained, led by competent officers, but they were supported by a logistics system that belonged to an earlier era, that relied on horses and railroads and requisitioned civilian vehicles. When German units advanced beyond their railheads, they began to starve for supplies. When American units advanced, they brought their supply bases with them, mobile and adaptable, capable of functioning anywhere that trucks could reach. This was the revolution in military affairs that World War II represented, the transformation of warfare from an art practiced by soldiers into an industrial process managed by organizations. The United States did not win World War II because it had better generals than Germany, though some American generals were certainly talented. It did not win because American soldiers were braver, though American soldiers demonstrated courage throughout the war. It won because American industrial civilization proved superior at the systematic application of organized violence on a continental scale. The symbolic weight of American logistics fell most heavily, not on German soldiers but on German civilians, who in the final months of the war witnessed the disintegration of their own supply systems even as American forces advanced with what seemed like unlimited resources. German cities were starving. Food rations had been cut repeatedly. Coal for heating was unavailable. The transportation system was crippled by Allied bombing, and yet the German military, even in defeat, was ordered to fight to the last cartridge, to hold every position, to never surrender. The contrast between what German civilians endured and what they observed about American forces was psychologically devastating. When American troops occupied German towns in the spring of 1945, they brought with them the full apparatus of American supply. Field kitchens served hot meals. Medical units treated not just soldiers but civilians. Supply depots appeared seemingly overnight, stocked with food, medicine, clothing. The Americans did not live off the land, did not requisition civilian supplies, did not strip occupied territories the way German forces had done in Poland and Russia and across occupied Europe. They brought everything they needed with them. Frau Elizabeth Schneider, a school teacher in the Rhineland town of Remagen, kept a diary during the final months of the war. Her entry for March 10, 1945, 3 days after American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen and established a bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine, described watching American supply convoys cross the bridge. For 3 days now, the American vehicles have been crossing the bridge in continuous stream. I went to the riverbank this morning and stood watching trucks, tanks, ambulances, jeeps, vehicles I cannot identify. They cross, unload, and return empty to cross again loaded. I tried to understand how they have so many vehicles. Our own army requisitioned every truck, every car, even farm tractors, and still our soldiers walk or ride horses. The Americans seem to have more vehicles than soldiers. It is like watching a river flow, endless, This is why we lost the war, not because our soldiers did not fight bravely, but because we were fighting a force that operates by rules we do not understand, that draws on resources we cannot match. This realization that Germany had been fighting not just an enemy army but an entire industrial civilization became a common theme in German accounts of the war's end. The traditional language of military analysis, which spoke of tactics and strategy and operational art, seemed inadequate to describe what had happened. Germany had not been outfought in any conventional sense. It had been buried under an avalanche of production, drowned in a sea of supplies, crushed by the sheer weight of industrial output transformed into military power. The truck became In this context, more than just a military vehicle, it became a symbol of American civilization itself, of a society organized around mass production, standardization, efficiency, and abundance. The Deuce and a Half represented everything that distinguished America from its enemies and even from its allies: the ability to produce complex machines in vast quantities, to deploy them across oceans, to maintain them in the field, to use them as tools of military power with casual competence. Consider the fate of a single truck, one of millions produced during the war. In July 1944, a CCKW truck rolled off the assembly line at General Motors plant in Pontiac, Michigan. It was loaded onto a freight train and shipped to the port of New York. It was driven onto a Liberty ship along with dozens of other vehicles and shipped across the Atlantic to Southampton, England. It was driven off the ship, assigned to a truck company in the Red Ball Express, and spent the autumn of 1944 driving supplies from Normandy beaches to frontline units in France. In December, it was reassigned to Third Army and participated in the movement north during the Battle of the Bulge. In January, it carried ammunition forward during the reduction of the German city. In March, it crossed the Rhine and carried supplies into Germany. In May, it was in Czechoslovakia when the war in Europe ended. That truck traveled over 20,000 miles during its service in Europe. It required routine maintenance, oil changes, tire replacements, brake adjustments, but it never suffered a major mechanical failure. It was driven by multiple drivers, none of whom received special training on this specific vehicle because the controls were standardized, identical across all trucks of its type. It carried everything from artillery shells to medical supplies to fresh bread. It was not heroic, not memorable, not the subject of any citation or commendation. It was simply one component in a vast machine, performing its function reliably, allowing the armies it supplied to operate with confidence that supplies would arrive when needed. When the war ended, that truck was declared surplus. It was sold to a French farmer who used it for the next 20 years to haul produce to market. It ended its working life as a parts source for other vehicles. That was finally scrapped in the 1970s and passed out of existence without ceremony or recognition. But that truck, and the millions like it, won World War II more certainly than any battle, any general, any weapons system. They represented the mobilization of American industrial might, the transformation of assembly lines into instruments of national power, the projection of American abundance across oceans and into the heart of Europe. They were the answer to the question that German commanders asked themselves in the winter of 1944. How did America move an army in a night? The answer was, with trucks, with an organization, with systematic planning, with an industrial base that could produce vehicles faster than combat could destroy them, with a civilization that had mastered the art of turning resources into power. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last offensive in the West, but the lessons of that battle echoed through the remaining months of the war and beyond. German commanders learned that the initiative had passed irreversibly to the Allies, that Germany could no longer mass forces for major operations without being detected and crushed by overwhelming material superiority. German soldiers learned that courage and skill were not enough when facing an enemy who could replace losses in days while German losses were irreplaceable. German civilians learned that the promises of Nazi propaganda that secret weapons would turn the tide, that willpower could overcome material disadvantage, that Germany's destiny was to dominate Europe were lies, and that the price of believing those lies would be paid in destroyed cities and broken lives. For the American soldiers who participated in Third Army's movement north, the experience was less dramatic than it appeared to outside observers. They did what they had been trained to do. They followed orders, they drove through the night, they attacked when told to attack. Many of them were not aware of the larger significance of their movement, did not understand that they were participating in an operation that would be studied for generations. They were cold, tired, hungry. They wanted the war to end. They wanted to go home. But in aggregate, their individual actions, the driver who kept his truck moving despite exhaustion, the officer who coordinated traffic at a crossroads, the mechanic who repaired a broken engine in sub-zero temperatures, the supply clerk who calculated fuel requirements, the radio operator who maintained communications, the cook who prepared hot meals for men coming out of the line constituted something greater than the sum of its parts. They constituted the functioning of an organizational system that was, in its own way, as revolutionary as any technological innovation of the war. The atomic bomb would become the symbol of American power in the post-war world, the ultimate weapon that demonstrated American scientific and industrial superiority. But the atomic bomb was not used in Europe. In Europe, the war was won by trucks and gasoline and canned rations and artillery, shells and all the mundane products of American industry, deployed in vast quantities, supported by organizational structures that allowed them to be used effectively. The bomb represented the possibility of absolute destruction. The truck represented something more subtle and perhaps more significant: the ability to project power sustainably, to support military operations indefinitely, to wage war not as a series of climactic battles, but as a continuous process of applied force. In the decades after World War II, As historians and military theorists analyzed the conflict, the phrase logistics war entered the vocabulary of strategic studies. It described a type of warfare in which victory was determined not primarily by tactical or operational skill, but by the ability to sustain military operations over time, to replace losses, to keep forces supplied and equipped. World War II, and particularly the war in Europe from 1944 onward, was recognized as the first fully developed logistics war, a conflict in which industrial production and organizational efficiency were as important as battlefield courage or command genius. The United States had won that logistics war decisively. By war's end, American factories had produced over 300,000 aircraft, over 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, over 2 million trucks, over 8 million rifles, over 40 billion rounds of ammunition. These numbers were not just larger than what Germany or Japan produced, they were larger by orders of magnitude. And crucially, American industry had delivered these weapons not just to American forces but to Allied forces as well. The Soviet Union received over 400,000 trucks from the United States under Lend-Lease, vehicles that allowed the Red Army to maintain its offensive momentum across Eastern Europe. Britain received supplies that kept its war economy functioning despite the devastation of German bombing. Even Free French forces and resistance movements were equipped largely with American weapons. This flood of production, this cornucopia of industrial output, fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. It meant that tactical defeats could be absorbed and reversed. It meant that battles did not have to be won efficiently, did not have to minimize losses, because losses could be replaced. It meant that commanders could afford to be cautious, to rely on firepower rather than maneuver, to overwhelm enemy positions with material superiority rather than risk clever flanking attacks or daring strategic gambits. It meant that the United States could fight a war of attrition and win, because American industrial capacity could sustain attrition indefinitely while enemy capacity could not. This approach to warfare, material-intensive, focused on logistics and sustainability rather than tactical brilliance, became the American way of war. It was not glorious in the traditional sense. It did not produce the kind of dramatic victories that made for heroic narratives, but it worked. It worked in World War II, and it would continue to work, with modifications. In the conflicts that followed, the German tank commander Hauptmann Wolf, sitting in his prisoner of war camp in France in the summer of 1945, watching American supply convoys roll past on the nearby highway, to have time to reflect on what he had witnessed. In conversations with other German officers, he tried to articulate what was different about the American approach to war. It was not that American soldiers were supermen, not that American tanks were invincible, not that American generals were strategic geniuses. It was something more fundamental. "They have turned war into a business operation," Wolf said one evening, speaking to a circle of fellow prisoners. "They have applied the methods of their factories, their corporations, their entire economy, and they have made war into a process that can be managed, optimized, scaled up. We still thought of war as an art, as a contest of wills, as something that could be won through courage and skill, and tactical brilliance. They understood that war in the 20th century is industry. The side with more factories wins. The side that can move more supplies wins. The side that can replace losses faster wins. All our training, all our experience, all our tactical doctrine was obsolete before we even began." One of the other officers objected. "But we fought well. We won tactical victories throughout the war. We won battles and lost the war," Wolf interrupted. "And we lost the war not because we were defeated in battle, but because we could not sustain our operations. We ran out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of replacements, out of time. The Americans never ran out of anything. That is why they won." This conversation, or conversations like it, took place in prisoner of war camps across Europe in the summer and autumn of 1945. As German officers tried to understand their defeat, the explanations they arrived at were variations on Wolf's theme. Germany had been defeated by American industrial power, by organizational superiority, by a systematic approach to warfare that German military culture had not anticipated or prepared for. The Germans had studied American tactics, American equipment, American command structures, but they had not understood the deeper reality that American military power was an expression of American industrial civilization, and that defeating American forces in battle was meaningless. If American industry could replace those losses faster than Germany could inflict them, that the snow fell again over the Ardennes in December 1945. On the first anniversary of the German offensive, the landscape bore scars that would take decades to heal. The forests were torn by shell fire, the roads rutted from the passage of thousands of vehicles, the towns damaged by battle. But the battle itself was already passing into history, becoming a story told by veterans, a subject for historians, a case study for military academies. The soldiers who fought there would remember the cold, the fear, the exhaustion. They would remember comrades lost, positions held, attacks made, the tactical details of individual actions. The small dramas of combat that meant everything to the men involved would be recorded in unit histories and personal memoirs. But the larger meaning of the battle, The significance that would emerge only with time and distance was not about any individual action or even any particular phase of the fighting. It was about the moment when industrial warfare reached its full expression, when the factory and the battlefield merged, when the ability to produce and deliver supplies became more important than the ability to outfight the enemy tactically. The Battle of the Bulge was the last time Germany would attempt a major offensive operation, the last time German commanders would try to win through tactical brilliance and operational daring. It failed not because the plan was flawed, though it was ambitious to the point of fantasy. It failed not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, though by December 1944 the average quality of German troops had declined as veterans were killed and replaced by undertrained recruits. It failed because Germany was fighting an enemy that had solved the fundamental problem of modern war: how to project industrial power across continents, how to turn factories into weapons, how to wage war not as a series of battles but as a continuous application of organized force supported by supplies. When Hauptmann Friedrich Wolf stood in the turret of his Panther tank in the pre-dawn darkness of December 22, 1944, and watched American columns rolling north through the valley below him, he was witnessing the future. He was seeing what war would look like for the rest of the 20th century. Not the clash of heroic warriors, not the brilliant maneuver or the daring gambit, but the systematic application of industrial capacity, the logistics war in which victory belonged to the side that could deliver more supplies, faster, more reliably, over greater distances. The trucks that rolled through the Ardennes in those December days were not glamorous. They did not inspire songs or paintings or monuments, but they were, in their own way, as revolutionary as any weapon of the war. They represented the mobilization of American abundance, the transformation of industrial capacity into military power, the victory of organization and planning and systematic thinking over individual heroism and tactical genius. And the German soldiers who watched those trucks roll past, who counted them in their hundreds and thousands and gave up counting because the numbers were too large to comprehend, understood in that moment something that would take historians years to articulate fully: that they had been defeated not by better soldiers or better generals or better weapons, but by a better system, by an entire civilization organized around principles of mass production and efficient distribution and systematic coordination, by an enemy who had brought to war the same methods they applied to every other aspect of their society. The Battle of the Bulge was decided not in Bastogne, though Bastogne mattered. It was decided not on the battlefield, though battles were fought. It was decided on the roads of Luxembourg and Belgium, in the movement of 250,000 men and 40,000 vehicles across 100 miles of winter terrain in 72 hours, in the transformation of a defensive crisis into an offensive opportunity through the application of logistics as a weapon, in the demonstration that America could move an army in a night and strike with the force of an industrial civilization made manifest, in steel and gasoline and organizational will. And when the last truck rolled through, when the last supply convoy had passed, when the last German position had been overrun and the last German soldier had surrendered or withdrawn or died, what remained was not just victory but a new understanding of what power meant in the modern world. Power was not heroism. Power was not courage. Power was not even superior tactics or brilliant strategy. Power was the ability to deliver overwhelming force sustainably, continuously. Power was logistics. Power was trucks rolling through the snow, carrying supplies that would never run out, supporting soldiers who could be replaced, projecting the strength of a nation that had mastered the art of turning abundance into victory. The snow continued to fall over the earth, silent and cold, covering the battlefield where the old ways of war had died and the future had been born. A future in which the factory mattered more than the fortress, in which the supply convoy mattered more than the shock attack, in which the ultimate question of warfare was not who could fight better but who could deliver more. America had answered that question in December 1944, had answered it so decisively that the answer would echo through the decades that followed, a lesson written in the tracks of 10,000 trucks rolling through winter darkness, carrying the weight of a civilization that had learned to turn prosperity into power and power into victory without limit, without end.